Welcome to Free Kiwis. We're delighted today to be joined by Professor Eric Kaufmann, who is at the University of Buckingham, and his work is in politics. And Professor Kaufmann, I understand a lot of your work has been actually about the growth of religion. Is that accurate?
I've done there's a couple of sort of strings to my bow, I guess you'd say. I mean, one is looking at questions of national identity, nationalism, and in relation to immigration and demographic change. The other one, I did a book in 2010 where I looked at population shifts in religion. So to what extent um, will religion kind of become more powerful in the world on the back of favorable demography, if you like,
I see.
both globally and within countries. So that's both. I mean, it's partly to do with higher birth rates amongst fundamentally religious people compared to, let's say, non-religious, and then also the world's population growth being in places that are religious essentially, and the sort of aging part of the world is the more secular part of the world. So that's
I
sort
see.
of that was the theme of the book in 2010. Shall the religious inherit the earth? It's interesting because looking back on it now, the whole question of populations become more and more talked about. At the time, there were only small numbers talking about how population shifts affect politics, and now it's quite pronounced.
Well, indeed. And I've been reading a lot recently about the prospect of population collapse in very many parts of the world. I believe by about 2070, the world's population will have peaked, and in very populous countries like China, it already has.
Exactly, yeah. So there is this trend towards birth rates that are well below the replacement rate of 2.1, and that started in Europe about 40 or 50 years ago, and in the US a bit more recently. Um, and then after sort of 40 years, you then start to see that population decline, were it not for immigration. And those trends have, yeah, deepened all over the world, with the exception of largely of sub-Saharan Africa and a few bits like Afghanistan and Pakistan, but
Right.
basically. And so, essentially that trend is continuing, and it seems like, at least in developed countries, the one, again, the counter trend, people who are religious and attend regularly tend to have a replacement level of fertility, and those who are, sort of non-religious, secular, etc., it's extremely low. I mean, it's sort of heading towards one child per woman average. So partly it's just saying, well, what are the implications of that going forward? And then, of course, you have groups like the ultra-Orthodox Jews and the Amish and others who are either technology denying or world denying, and they've got, five, six, seven kids per woman on
Right.
average. You just have to run the math. The Amish have been doing that for 100 some odd years. If you run the math forward, it's sort of, it's quite interesting to speculate where that goes.
Yeah.
So yeah,
I mean, I suppose a lot depends, though, on the extent to which their progeny carry on the religion, right? Whether I have no idea whether the children of Amish tend to stick around the communities or not, or of Orthodox Jews, or even, moderately religious Christians. Do they tend to stick with it?
right.
And is there a countervailing force in secular culture that tends to draw, young adults away from their religious roots? Have you
I
looked into
mean,
that
yes, is
question?
the Yeah, I mean that. So I definitely those were the two parts of the equation: the raw birth rate differential, and then the switching or loss. And just looking at retention. And the thing about the very strict world denying groups is they have both high birth rates and very high retention rates. And so that's what leads to the sort of explosive growth potential. Whereas you then get some groups like the Mormons. Mormons are kind of in the middle, who, because they're proselytizing, they have to kind of be open to the modern world. And once that happens, you are as likely to lose as to gain.
Hmm.
And certainly with any conventional religious groups, Protestant, Catholic, and so on, um, there's going to be very high drop off and secularization. At least it depends, but generally speaking, so what you have actually in the sort of more mainstream religious groups is, yes, somewhat higher fertility, but that's more than overcome by religious loss and decline.
Right.
But in these sort of strict groups like the ultra-Orthodox, just to give you a number, in 1960, the ultra-Orthodox were maybe a few percentage points of the Jewish school system in Israel, and it's now a third
All right.
um, of the first grade class. And yeah, I think by 2050, the ultra-Orthodox will have taken over. They will be the majority in amongst British and American observant Jews. This is just unthinkable not that long ago. So yeah, when you have that combination of high birth rates and high retention, it's a pretty unstoppable combination.
Although I wonder the extent to which those, or their kind of cloistered lifestyles depend on a larger group of people in the population at large to support it, and whether if they reached a certain critical mass of the total population, what they do would no longer be sustainable for economic reasons apart from anything else.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I mean, in Israel, certainly they received certain kinds of subsidies and exemptions. My view is they probably are willing to endure quite a bit of poverty
Mm-hmm.
to have their scholar society with men just studying Torah and not working. And a few of them maybe in the diamond trade subsidizing the others. I don't know. I think that it's going to have to get quite dire before they're going to break on that.
Yeah.
So I'm not, and I don't think withdrawing subsidies, in which has happened periodically, depending on which coalition is in power in Israel, it's made only a modest difference, really. So I'm not convinced. I think things would have to get pretty bad for them to break, is my view.
Yeah, you may well be right. It's an interesting question as well, and I don't know how much you've thought about this, but I mean, I suppose philosophers like Nietzsche saw it in the 19th century, that the decline of religion. I mean, if I think about his description of the death of God, it wasn't anything jubilant, even though he was himself an atheist. He decried the death of God as a catastrophe that would be very difficult for us to recover from, and in some ways foresaw the totalitarianism of the 20th century, Nazism, fascism, communism, as what would become inevitable as a result of the loss of the spiritual center that the church had given at least Europe for a very long time. And I wonder now, and this sort of relates to another part of your work, whether, what we might call the woke movement, if indeed it is a movement, and if, that word makes sense, is some sort of a religious replacement. It certainly seems to have some of the hallmarks of a religion. It has an ideology that tolerates very little dissent. It excommunicates people who don't adhere to it. What do you think about that? Is it a warped fulfilling of the religious instinct in some way?
Well, yeah, I think it definitely. I agree with people like John McWhorter, Joshua Mitchell, and others that it is a religion. I think yes, it doesn't have a sense of a higher power and the supernatural, but in that kind of Emil Durkheim definition of religion is a community that worships itself and that has these sort of sacred elements. Absolutely, I think original sin, whether it be patriarchy, racism, you name it, and the fallen white male, that's kind of, and then you have this sort of worshipped totems, Black, Indigenous, and then later trans and etc. So you have this kind of totem pole of the sacred groups that are worshipped at the top, and then the fallen at the bottom, which is really what and then of course you have anyone who blasphemes by saying anything that might be interpreted as offensive to the totemic groups is excommunicated and more or less is punished with extreme prejudice in a way. So that's that. There are many of these, and then of course you've got all of the the symbols, whether it be taking the knee, the jazz hands, wearing the rainbow colors, whatever it is. There are a number of these different symbolic elements that are like wearing a cross to show you're a Christian. Well,
Right.
you could wear a BLM t-shirt, or there are many different ways you can signify your adherence to this religion. So yeah, I definitely think that that's operative. But the key, and I think the key there is the sacredness around the totemic minority groups, the Holy Trinity, race, gender, sexual identity. That's the center of this religion.
Right.
And that's why people get canceled, because they're seen to be profaning the sacred, and therefore they're cast, dehumanized as sort of, the devil in a way. So yeah, I think that's a very useful way of thinking about this. And then now, of course, the only thing I would say is I don't think being religious is necessarily going to inoculate you. And you just have to look at so many of the religious authorities, whether it be the Archbishop of Canterbury,
Yeah.
even some of the things the Pope's done. You look at even some of the theologians in the evangelical denominations, and heavily taken in by the sort of BLM critical race theory message. I just saw that the Church of England's got, I think it's like is it a billion? No, it's not. Maybe a £1 million fund and working group on slavery, and how the churches benefit from it, and basically making this a central focus of the Church of England. Never mind that, obviously the English church has been involved in some way in the anti-slavery movement. That's what's distinctive, rather than being involved in slavery, which is sort of human universal.
Right.
But no, it's got to be this focus on. And so, yeah, I don't, where I think you see an inoculation is more where if someone in the US, for example, identifies as a Christian, they're more likely to be Republican. It's the Republican patriotic element that really prevents you from going down the woke road. But if you look at data, as I have, and survey data, I do a lot of quantitative studies. I mean, if you take a Republican, or let's say a Democrat who is strongly religious, even born again, and a Democrat who is secular, you don't see much difference in their likelihood of subscribing to white guilt, for example, and a number of these other things related to wokeness. So I think you can actually have multiple religions going at the same time.
Well, it may depend perhaps on the strength of the religious conviction in question. I mean, it might be quite hard to imagine the ultra-Orthodox Jews or the Amish being all that susceptible to it. And maybe that's because they're cloistered, and maybe it's just because their own religious tradition is so strong that it's much more impervious to the intrusion of something like the woke version of religion.
Well, I think it depends. This book called Critical Dilemmas by Shenvi and Sawyer, where they're looking at the sort of an evangelical perspective on woke, and there's a lot of the top levels, the leadership levels of the evangelical Protestant movement that were relatively sympathetic to many aspects of this critical race theory. And so my take home from that is I think part of the issue there is that, and this is even though 90% of their parishioners are voting for Trump and so on, but I think that that more New Testament missionary type of proselytizing Christianity has got a certain susceptibility, whereas I think it's more the neo-Calvinist, very much Old Testament based Protestantism that would be more resistant. So I think it's probably theologically there are probably certain strands that are resistant and others that are not.
I mean, that's interesting, because I would have thought Calvinism has quite a lot in common with, the woke in terms of its morality structure. I mean, obviously the specific beliefs are different, because wokedom has no God, whereas the Calvinists obviously do. But that concept of not only original sin, but kind of almost predestination that the Calvinists believed in is arguably there in the woke take on, say, race, whereas if you're white, you're sort of indelibly stained as racist. and kind of unsavable. And also, I mean, even more than Calvinists, there seems to be an utter lack of a redemptive mechanism. Like once you've fallen foul or violated the tenets or committed heresy, or however you like to put it, you're sort of forever damned, and there's no way back.
Yeah, that's true. You're right that it has a kind of Calvinist structure to it, but maybe that's why Calvinism is more resistant.
Right.
The other thing too, of course, is the more textual, cerebral nature of Calvinism as opposed to the more Pentecostal, emotional, which is really the register that wokeness operates in. So it's all about emotions, empathy, guilt, and it's a different. It's not really about necessarily about text and doctrine as much. I mean, I think that's maybe another reasons for it. So anything that is a bit more about expressing holiness as emotion, I think might be more susceptible. If I were to say where the sort of susceptibility lies, and yeah, so it's an interesting question. The other thing I've looked at these issues. So, for example, if you don't have religion, if you're secular, are you more likely to say that politics is an important source of meaning in your life? There's some polling on this,
Right.
and it turns out that it's not the case. That actually people who are religious but progressive are more likely to sort of say politics is meaningful in their life than someone who's secular and progressive. I mean, and so it's kind of it doesn't seem to crowd out politics as a source of meaning. If you're religious, it doesn't seem to sort of be antagonistic to being very much into political religion.
Mm.
You could just see it certainly with these denominations like Episcopalianism and Anglicanism, where there's a lot of wokeness certainly in the priesthood.
Right. I mean, the Church of England is about as limp a religion as you can imagine. I was raised in the Anglican Church myself, and it doesn't seem to have anything that you particularly have to believe to belong to it. So it seems to me, quite easy to overrun with other ideas from that perspective. But it's interesting that you say that a lot of the evangelicals are actually quite susceptible. So
yeah, the evangelical elites, yeah, and part of this is that they hear from, say, Black and not so much Hispanic, but evangelical elites. Their world is this kind of global evangelical world based on universal principles. I mean, in a way, woke is also got. I mean, it has a sort of it's got this religious ethics of whoever has more oppression points is holier, and whoever has less is. So there is a sort of universal principle there. And so those who just say this is identity politics, I think, are making a big mistake.
Yeah.
I think John McWhorter says it's about who is hurting who. It's not just about identifying with your tribe. It's actually about stepping back and bowing your head when someone with more points comes along, even if they're not your identity. So it's not really identity politics. It's actually a hierarchy, and it's a sort of moral system. Yeah.
Now, I think you've described woke or the kind of battle against it as being a battle for the foundations of Western civilization. I may be misquoting you slightly there, but something along those lines.
Yeah, that's right. I think that it's too often trivialized in the press as just some meaningless culture wars taking place on campus. But no, I mean, if you think about free speech, objective truth, reality-based institutions such as courts and universities, supposedly, equal treatment, due process, all of the sort of foundations of, the Enlightenment, or what Jonathan Rauch calls the truth-based order. All of that is, I think, threatened by this, as is, by the way, national heritage and community and civilizational tradition. All of that is. So there's really two prongs to woke, so you have woke, which is this making sacred of historically marginalized groups, and then that leads to the moral intuition, which is really about equal outcomes, even if we have to discriminate against certain groups like whites or males or Asians. And so it's equal outcomes plus emotional harm protection. And that's really speech codes and cancel culture side of the equation.
Right.
So what that does is it hits both the Enlightenment stuff, free speech and rationality, but it also hits the national identity, the national past, heroes, cohesion, all of that is attacked as well. So you have
Mm.
these sort of two prongs, the anti-illiberal prong and the anti-conservative prong. Yeah, so I think it really is foundational. And actually, even people who don't understand, which is a lot of people who don't necessarily grasp the culture wars, if you explain, for example, that the culture wars affects almost everything, you if you think about an inability of the US to control its southern border or the crime surge, for example, that happened after George Floyd, or what's happening in education in terms of falling standards, healthcare systems, all of this stuff is being affected
Yeah.
by the paralysis that's when debates are being shut down because of red lines and sacred values, then you can't have an optimal political system. So there's just so many things that it affects.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that you mentioned the Mexican American border, because I might take that as a metaphor for the whole movement, in a way that they're trying to collapse borders, say, between male and female, or between different kinds of morality, and it seems, I mean, I guess maybe this is its postmodern element or something like that, where the kind of categories that we've operated with, at least since the Enlightenment, are being eroded by this kind of thinking, the border between rationality and irrationality, this kind of thing. What's your take on that?
Yeah, that's a really interesting observation, and you're right. There is this thrust to always deconstruct um, boundaries, partly because categories are seen as oppressive. Derrida with that idea that
Yeah.
any binary involves some form of domination, and therefore you have to get rid of them. Although clearly they're very strategic about it, and Yasha Monk talks about this in his book, The Identity Trap, where you transgender, great, transracial, oh my God, that you can't
Yes,
do
that's a
that.
fascinating one to me. I mean, in some ways, it's like they've taken the least important of human characteristics, which is race, and made that the category that you can't challenge. You can't you
Yeah,
can't
and
you can't cross from one race to another. Whereas you might say that sex has a certain degree of biological importance going back before the human race, and yet that can be collapsed at will.
yeah, and now it is worth saying that even on the sex stuff, so they'll say, yeah, male, female, you can transgress that. But then on the other hand, when they're handing out money on affirmative action grounds, or trying to get a certain quota of people on the judiciary or in the CEO, top corporate jobs, suddenly they get very essential, like which tick one of these boxes. You're either a man or a female, and then we want to make sure it's 50-50.
Maybe, but I'm sure that if it was a trans woman, they'd be happy to count them as female.
That's true. So maybe what you need is these male CEOs to say they're women, and then we made our quota. But
Or if one was a
but even
scientist applying for a grant, one could strategically transition.
yeah, I wonder what they would like if you just ticked the female box. Let's say if you were trying to get a science grant,
Mm.
and I just wonder how they would then prove that you weren't one if you insisted you were one. I in their
They'd have no grounds to, would they? Because it's all by self-declaration.
yeah, yeah.
So,
But even in other ways. So, for example, if a girl decides she likes pink dresses and dolls, that's seen as social construction. If a boy likes pink dresses and dolls, that's seen as just something welling up from inside, just
yeah.
innate, natural. And so they switch, they kind of toggle very quickly from the blank slate to, oh no, it's just like a gendered soul, something deep, just almost DNA.
I think that's what I mean by the collapsing the boundary between the rational and irrational, or at least,
Yeah.
transgressing that boundary strategically at will.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. So it's just another tool that they can use in this quest So what the thing, I guess what I'm saying is I think you're right that they do transgress these boundaries, but it's all towards this political goal of equal, leveling down the strong groups and raising up the oppressed groups in their estimation and protecting from emotional harm, any against anything that could be construed as racist, sexist, transphobic, and you name it. So I think they're going to be very instrumental. I mean, part of my argument is therefore that I don't think that any of these ideological moves like postmodernism or critical theory is so central to what's going on. I don't think the cerebral intellectual side is the driver. I think it's a much deeper emotional, irrational
That's
thing, which is
interesting.
just
So
yeah.
what do you put that down to then? If you don't necessarily sheet it back to Derrida or the Frankfurt School or whatever, what has caused this emotional surge, if we can characterize it like that, that's resulted in what seems to be a very sudden and radical departure from our civilizational moorings?
Yeah, well, I think it happens in sort of two steps. You get this, what I would call a fascist scare, which is sort of an overdeveloped catastrophizing of the majority. So essentially the sensibility is majority equal bad, minority equals good. So that's a very simple plus minus effective structure. And that's really the driver in my view. And it just gets more and more intense over the decades. It begins slowly in the 1920s and 30s with this fear of the masses and fear of fascism, and to some degree justifiably, but that then takes on a life of its own. So bashing the majority is kind of a reflex amongst intellectuals already in the early and mid 20th century in the US, certainly. The sort of Anglo-Protestant rural mass of the US population was already a bit of a punching bag, even in that period. And then you get the rise of the civil rights movement, and it's all driven by particularistic emotional attachments to particular groups, like African Americans, and then it spreads from there to
Right.
Native Americans, and then to female and feminism, and then gays and lesbians, and
But
that's, in my view, the driver. Yeah.
but wouldn't you say that sort of mid to late 20th century drive, second wave feminism, the civil rights movement, and so on, that I would say that was much more rooted in Enlightenment values of equality of people rather than uh, seeking necessarily the same outcomes for everybody. I mean, Martin Luther King, in his famous speech, is on about everybody being treated the same, and now he seems to be, very much unfashionable with the critical race theorists who, as we've reflected, sort of cast white people as being the indelibly racist oppressors. So it seems to me a different kind of a thing. And again, second wave feminism was, I would argue, addressing some valid issues that women were up against at that time, and they weren't necessarily looking to I don't know, look for the same outcomes for men and women, but just opportunities for women to have employment in places that they hadn't before, and so on.
Yeah, no, and I'd agree. This is where it gets really tricky. So they were working with the grain of classical liberal equal treatment, all of that, freedom of speech, reason, all of that. Martin Luther King, up until a certain point. But the question that I guess you have to ask is, were they being guided by principles or sentiment? So you have some principled, so in the civil rights movement, someone like a Bayard Rustin, for example, was a highly principled classical liberal, wanted equal treatment, and that's what he was about. But there were not so many of that kind of person. I mean, it seems like what happened was people then got attached to the emotional story of equality, not a set of principles that everybody should be treated equally. But treated equally means, we haven't got equal results, and therefore it's not enough just to have equal rights. We've also got to level the playing field in other ways. And very quickly, from 1965, you then get Lyndon Johnson talking about equal results, and goals and timetables comes in, and a couple of years later, already a few riots happen, and already it's about affirmative action in contracting and hiring, and very quickly it's into equal results, and we're going to discriminate against people in order to achieve those equal results.
Right.
And it happens without them even thinking about it, because I would argue they become attached to the story, the emotion, which is about equality. And we're into equality, and kind of what that emotional structure is about is whites and males are kind of the baddies in this story, and minorities are kind of the good ones. It's the second wave feminism is something very similar. It gets radical very quickly. Legitimate points about women accessing the workforce moving very quickly into talking about patriarchy and talking about oppression, families as inherently oppressive, and there's some quite radical stuff by the late 60s in feminism too.
Right.
So it just seems like it happened very quickly. And I actually think those were the origins, not the postmodernism and the critical theory. I mean, that was more things, evolving, perhaps getting crazier, but still, I think the foundations are laid really much earlier than that.
So you disagree with the likes of Helen Blackrose and James Lindsay in their Cynical Theories book, where they do trace it back to the postmodernists and the critical theorists.
Yeah, I think that that's too recent. I don't disagree with. I mean, I think it's a fantastic book, and they're right in many ways. These are useful tools. It's useful to be able to deconstruct, scientific rationality, so that you can attack the Western progress narrative. All that's useful, but I just think it's driven by something else, which you can trace back to the 60s. And this is where Richard Hanania and Chris Rufo and their books really take things back right to the 60s and what occurs. Whether this be the Weather Underground and Black Power movements and their connections to BLM and Antifa today, which are many, or whether this be civil rights law and affirmative action, hostile environment, disparate impact, all of these Supreme Court doctrines and the civil rights bureaucracy that forms the human rights or human resources departments, the racial sensitivity training. I mean, this is all happening. Racial sensitivity training is already underway, late 60s, happening in the 70s. Now, it's not happening at the scale that it later happens, but I think most of the foundations were in place. It's sort of making sacred of Black Americans, Indigenous, and to some degree, women, that these are not topics you could talk about rationally without getting in some way attacked as a sexist or racist. That was already happening. Now, it may have started small in Berkeley and in a few places, in academia first, but then it spreads off campus, particularly in what I think is distinctive in the 2010s is this off-campus shift due to social media and a new partisan media. That's what's distinctive. But I think the ideas are not that distinctive, except for trans. Everything else had largely, I think, been done.
Right. Now, I'd like to come back to the universities in a minute, because there's lots to talk about there. But first, just to return to the first part of the conversation, if woke is a religion and a foundational threat to Western civilization, and also, in the light of what you're talking about in terms of demographic shifts and birth rates and so on, presumably it won't be a threat forever, because they're quite against breeding a lot of the time, or having children. So one might think that from that perspective, it won't be a long-lived phenomenon. If in fact it's the more conservative religions that are going to outbreed everybody else, then maybe that will take care of it in a few decades.
Well, yes. It will take care of it in the long run. You're right. I mean, I think Israel's a very interesting paradigm case for where much of the rest of the world will eventually go. I mean, because you have through higher birth rates, the more conservative religious elements have gradually taken more and more political power by dint of numbers. You see it in pockets in the US now. So I thought it was interesting in this Hamtramck area of Detroit, where you had a large Muslim protest at schools over the gender
Right.
ideology in school issue. And I think the city council fell to this more conservative Muslim group because this is an area of Muslim settlement. And all of these sort of pro-trans white progressives who thought these were their people of color allies were now suddenly confronted with the fact that they were out of power and their so-called allies had turfed them out.
Mm.
Yeah, so I think that's kind of an allegory for what could happen, is partly by facilitating the demographic rise of a number of more conservative religious elements and by having very few children themselves. Now they rely entirely on conversion, but converting the children of religious people is possible earlier when those religions are somewhat more innocent and less self-aware of who their enemy is. But over time, I think it just gets harder and harder to keep up the same conversion rate. So I would suspect we're going to see a hardening of that line between religious and non-religious, say in America, where it'll come to, almost if you are Christian, you will almost by definition be Republican. I mean, it's going to become more like that, and there will be a reluctance to date and marry across that more reluctance than there is today across that boundary between Republican Democrat, which we already know there's a strong intermarriage barrier. There's very few cross political marriages happening already,
Yeah.
but over time that will, I think, make, and the harder those boundaries are, the higher retention is going to be in each of these groups, and that's what will drive the demographic decline. So we haven't yet had the as hard a boundary between religious and non-religious, but the more that boundary thickens, the more you're going to get
Right.
retention.
And you can already see
So,
evidence of that in stuff like the research out of the Pew Institute that shows the extent to which Democrats and Republicans hate one another more and more as time goes on and want less and less to do with one another. If you put that together with a certain degree of geographical separation, you might say it's an existential threat to the United States. It's hard to see how a body politic that is so split can coexist in the same country, isn't it?
yeah, I mean, well, I don't think, for a number of reasons, I don't actually think it'll lead to a civil war for a number of reasons. I mean, one is that
I'm not
there's kind of,
necessarily suggesting like,
oh no,
the 1850s where they took up arms
right,
against one another literally in two big armies,
yeah.
but just maybe, a dissolution of the United States with certain states forming one country and other states forming another.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's interesting you mentioned that because there was a movement. Um, if you look at the West Coast states, a lot of them consist of the coastal areas on the west side of the mountains towards the ocean, and then once you cross the mountains, you're into the interior areas. And this is the same in Canada, by the way, in the West, in British Columbia. But once you cross the mountains, it's a more conservative culture. And there was a move to sort of, I think, secede from, is it Eastern Oregon and Washington? One of them was going to join with Idaho. These sorts of internal splits, because a lot of these democratic states actually consist of, highly democratic cities and then
Right.
relatively Republican hinterlands. So you have a kind of splitting within states, so it makes it trickier for states to just secede. Um,
Hmm.
but I think more than that, we're just going to see a sclerosis. When Congress is completely gridlocked because they can't even agree on a budget, and so you're going to get all of this kind of Congress essentially doesn't work. It doesn't pass laws because um, essentially everybody wants to block the other person's laws even when they agree with them. So I just think it makes the country more ungovernable.
Right.
Um, but I think the U.S. case, they're also somewhat helped by the fact, I guess, that the racial divides don't map onto the political divides very well, increasingly less so.
Mm.
So you have a kind of cross-cutting of race and politics. And that's preventing, let's say every Republican was white and every person of color, let's say, to use that horrible terminology, was a Democrat, then I think you'd have a serious problem.
Right. Yeah.
But it's not the case. Yeah.
So let's turn to universities. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it, in light of your analysis, that the very engines of knowledge production in certainly the early and mid and even into the late 20th century are the very place where this profoundly emotional movement, as you've described it, has most arguably had its origins and certainly been the strongest in the last couple of decades, even though it has now metastasized well and truly into the rest of our institutions and into the businesses and so on. Why do you think it is that what was, the most, I would say, powerful engine of knowledge production in human history, and that is the Western University, if you will, in even the late 19th century through to the 1980s or so, and after that it started to decline. Why was that the place where this really took hold?
Well, I think it took hold. I mean, it didn't just take hold in the university. It was also in the arts, for example, and literature and all of that. So, and certainly within sections of the left-wing political environment. I think these are all part of a common culture, which you might call, which I would call kind of this left-wing modernism, which kind of is on the avant-garde of a lot of these intellectual movements. And I just think they're the ones who, this emotional structure I talk about, where majorities bad, minorities good. This is already beginning in the early 20th century amongst Bohemian intellectuals.
Yeah.
This sort of very sort of catastrophizing approach to majorities of all kinds is already beginning, and it's not necessarily philosophically very coherent, but it's happening. And I just think that so I think left liberalism. I don't think most academics believe in utopian revolution and the Marxist or even a post-Marxist tearing down entirely of capitalism. They certainly like their paychecks, but I think that it's a sort of more of a mushy left liberalism that is about compassion and guilt, with a certain amount of utopianism glossed over it, that just appeals to a large number of academics, somewhat larger than in other sectors. And so what you see in the survey evidence, for example, is only about 1 in 10, well, it's about 1 in 10 academics will favor a firing campaign in any given scenario. I had 4 different scenarios. One was that, the two-parent family has better results, or the other is the empire did more good than harm. These various sorts of scenarios where you have academics reporting politically incorrect results, should such a person be forced out. It's only about 1 in 10 for most academics, but on the other hand, if you ask a question like, should you have mandatory diversity statements for hiring? 2 to 1 in favor.
Yeah.
So the group that's sort of in favor of canceling is relatively small, but the group that is in favor of policies which inadvertently chill speech. So another one would be race and gender quotas, a minimal quotas on reading lists. More support, like 45 to 33 was the number that I had. Roughly that ratio of 1.5 to 1 support for essentially affirmative action on reading lists. Now, of course, what if you say, well, okay, someone doesn't want to decolonize their reading list and doesn't want to abide by the quotas. What should happen to them? Should they be fired? Then they'll back away and say, well, no. Or how should they be punished for not refusing to adhere to this? And this is where it kind of gets tricky. They'll say, well, they should just be sent to diversity training. But that's also pretty that's actually pretty coercive as well. What if someone says they don't want to take diversity training? Should they be fired?
Then? Yeah. It's interesting how far they'd kind of go, but it seems to me that, you say only 1 in 10 is in favor of firing people. That to me is alarmingly high, and not only because, 1/10 is not that small a proportion, but more because clearly those people have extremely virulent views. They're going to be extremely vocal on campus. They're going to make a huge amount of noise. And so they're going to have a disproportionate effect on the culture at large in the university. And that kind of middle who are on the fence about these things or don't want to commit one way or the other, well, almost by definition, they're cowards. And so if you've got this small but extremely loud and aggressive group of bullies, well, what do you think they're going to do? The kind of quiet middle is just going to go along, isn't it? Because
yeah, but my point about that quiet middle is they're not quiet just because they're cowards. I mean, the point I make in my upcoming book, which really talks about this a bit more, is that they're also quiet because they're genuinely conflicted. Part of them is pro-cancel, and part of them is free speech. And they would rather, they're sitting on the fence because they actually have a lot of sympathy for the cancelers. And so it's not enough just to say, no, they're actually with us, but they're scared. No, well, actually, it's not the case.
I'm not saying they're with us. I'm saying...
Yeah.
Or, I mean, maybe they come in different kinds, right? There might be some who are genuinely agnostic or even lean towards academic freedom and free speech, but in the end, they're going to do as they're told by the bullies because they fear for their careers. And you have this phenomenon, where young academics don't want to speak up because they want to get tenure or they want to get promoted, and then older ones have got research grants at stake, so they don't want to risk those, and so on and so on. So you have a lot of self-interest involved as well.
Yeah, it completely. I mean, the self-interest kind of reinforces the kind of moral predilections. I mean, this is one of these things I've thought about is there is a relationship between how you think you'll be judged by your peers and your kind of internal morality, which is kind of, if you read like George Herbert Mead and others, you're being judged by your internal peers in a way. He has this concept of a generalized other, which is like this audience in your head that's judging you. And so I think there's a relationship there between your own morality and between the sort of peer pressures that are going on, that is connected in some way. But yeah, so I think there is the other part of this, of course, is the fact you have a sacredness around totemic minority groups means that if you are opposing something that is in their name, you're opposing something that's in the name of God, you kind of have the whiff of the devil about you. And so therefore, I think these small numbers can force, they can multiply their force just by wielding these taboos around race, gender, sexuality, to shut people up. So yeah, I think that combination means that it's going to be a relatively easy walk. I've seen this dynamic, all it takes is one radical in a room of 15 in a department meeting to completely change the freedom of discussion.
And what you're saying is that on average it'll be 1 in 10. So, go figure. Yeah. We've got a real problem.
Yeah, I mean, you might get a shy 1 in 10. I have sometimes seen these people who are pro-cancel but are actually reasonably nice people and are not aggressive. So you would need to get somebody who is both aggressive and in that 1 in 10. If you have one of those, then you're in big trouble.
Yeah, I've been in a school of education, so I've encountered a few of them. But one thing that I wasn't expecting, I mean, this phenomenon fairly clearly has its roots in the humanities rather than the sciences. But now it's invaded the sciences, and I wasn't prepared for that. I'm a scientist myself, and I thought that, well, certainly the people who trained me would have been impervious to it because they were so invested in scientific thinking and rigor and data and evidence. And if you found something you didn't like, well, that's a good thing. Whereas I see in your survey that there are various, hypothetical scientific findings that people think should be repressed, that actually science shouldn't be science anymore. It should bow to ideology when necessary.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of things that what I did find in terms of the scientists versus the social science and humanities, the scientists had fewer people identifying as far left. So it was only about a half the level of the social science humanities. So there are fewer far leftists in the sciences. There aren't more conservatives. There are very few conservatives in either, but in terms of far leftists, there's fewer.
Right.
That probably helps to some degree. But I think, you get in the sciences, there will be fewer of the radicals. But any radicals that exist, again, I don't think that there will be many people to stand up to them. Um, it seems to me some scientists that I've spoken to, they're willing to kind of just tip their cap to diversity statements, paste in what they're supposed to paste in, as long as they get their money to have their labs.
That's been my experience as well, and it's very short-sighted because they're signing the
Yeah,
death warrant of science by doing that, I believe, and that's why I call them cowards. If they're cowards or fools, because if they look ahead 10 or 20 years, first of all, if they're white and male, they're not going to be getting those research grants anymore.
right.
And secondly, the whole mission of science will come unstuck if we bow to ideology and say we won't talk about this perfectly valid scientific result because it flies in the face of what these ideologues tell us we're allowed to say.
Yeah, I mean, I think probably for most scientists whose work is not contentious, or maybe it's not yet contentious. I
Yeah,
mean, if you're just looking at solar systems and whatever, probably you're okay. So they're probably bracketing it and saying, as long as I'm not studying, certain biological questions about what is a male and a female. Or the relationship between genetics and intelligence, whatever. As long as I'm away from those hot button areas, I'm fine. But you're right that perhaps over time, if the kind of charlatans start to suck up more of the research money, that's going to damage you. And if there's affirmative action hiring, that's going to have some impact. Although, again, I think you get these, it's not as though they're firing white male scientists, they're just going to not hire.
right.
And
So,
so
so in
maybe
a
the people,
generation, then
yeah, but they may say, well, I'm fine. And
they may.
it'll be
Yeah,
the young ones that are going to pay.
yeah,
But so it's a certain selfishness as well that's
right.
part of this.
I mean, I think that's true, and you know, I don't excuse them for that either. I think in the end, if you're a scientist, you have a duty to science and to its future and to making sure that the best and brightest come through, and that it doesn't matter what race or sex they are, if they're the best and brightest. And yes, it's good
Right.
to encourage young women to see themselves in science. There's no problem with that, or people from minorities where that hasn't been a typical career path. By all means, encourage them to see that as an option. But in the end, when you're hiring someone, you want the best scientist you can get at that time. And if we veer away from that, I think not only does it undermine the quality of science as such, it undermines the psychological foundations in individual scientists that they need, because people know when they're betraying themselves, even or betraying their core values, even if they're trying to hide it from themselves, or say it's not going to affect me, or as long as I can study the moons of Jupiter or whatever, I'll be all right. So
Yeah.
I just think it's the death knell for the Enlightenment exercise, which is why I tend to agree with you that this is a battle for the foundations of the Enlightenment civilization, because it can't stand when people are not prepared to stand up for it for reasons of self-interest or cowardice.
Yeah, I mean, this is really what it's going to be really interesting to see how this pans out. I mean, you could take the view that, well, it's still covertly a merit, or it's still largely a merit-based system under the surface, maybe, but with some diversity hires who aren't meritorious. And that's kind of a tax that you pay, that the system will pay, but the bulk will continue to be, merit-based. My worry there is not so much necessarily that you're going to largely subvert the effectiveness of science, as much as the fact that these institutions are all upholding this ethos in the culture, which is an
Right.
irrational, anti-enlightenment kind of, equal outcomes ethos. And that's going to corrode, the corrosion and the rot is going to hurt other parts of the society a lot more. Not necessarily, I mean, the scientific enterprise will be damaged. It'll be a damaged ship, but it may not be completely destroyed. It may be still 80% effective.
I hope
But
you're
it's
right. I
more,
mean, my issue with that is that if you actually study the philosophy of science as well as psychology, and I'm a psychologist, so I've kind of studied
right.
both. I'm aware of how counterintuitive an exercise it is. So, Popper's idea of falsification, that's a very hard won idea in like culturally and philosophically speaking, because it runs against a whole lot of our built-in biases like confirmation bias and you know allegiance to in groups and all of that, because it's a kind of rigorous attack on one's own ideas. That's what a scientist does, when he or she sets out to falsify a theory, because it's usually their theory or one that they're interested in, and they're trying to pull it down. That's not a very
Yeah.
intuitive thing for a human being to do, and it's certainly antithetical to the, the woke approach, which is always to confirm one's preconceived ideas. So
Yeah.
that's why I
Oh,
think
I mean,
science and indeed democracy are more fragile than we might like to think, and extremely susceptible to being undermined by uh, by making scientists and Democrats falsify themselves, albeit
I mean,
for kind of reasons of self-interest or cowardice.
yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good point. It's a bit like the Lysenko issue in the
Right,
Soviet Union, right?
exactly.
Where you could get people to essentially parrot the party line but there's always the two cultures in academia, the more kind of humanities culture and the more science culture. And while they were complementary, but it now seems the humanities stroke social science culture is predatory. And the question is going to be how, which parts of the sciences, anything that's a little less material, a little less concrete is going to be susceptible. Probably medicine and biology a bit more corrupted than pure astrophysics. And,
Yeah.
and so, but anything where there's an opening, this virus will sort of swoop in and corrupt it.
Well, I don't know if
And
you've seen
right,
the idea of critical maths. Have you seen the
yes, yeah, I
I,
have. But you see what that's doing is that's damaging, ultimately it damages kids who probably, need to be taught basic mathematics in school.
yeah,
They're the ones suffering. And maybe by the time you get to somebody doing the sort of astrophysics, they're
they,
going to be
they're
already
not
very good at,
they're not really
yeah,
worrying
yeah,
about whether 2 + 2 = 4 or whether that might be racist to suggest that it
right.
does. Yeah. No, I mean, hopefully that's true. And the edifice of mathematics is probably the most logically rigorous, well, undoubtedly the most logically rigorous discipline in the university. So it's probably the least susceptible ultimately to all of this. But, perhaps if one really cared about the sciences, we'd be promoting a split in the university and have a university without the humanities. If the humanities are going to predate the sciences like that, then let's just, leave them to one side to do their thing and eat themselves alive, and then get on with science on the other.
Yeah, except the only problem is that, as we see in places like MIT, once the ideology is inside the gates, then it'll go after things even within the hard science. So even if you did have that separation, you would, within this new science institution, the rot would be inside the gates as well.
Yeah.
And it's only a question of how much tax it can extract and how much it can get in the way. And I just don't know the full answer to that question. It may be that it eventually eats the whole thing out completely. But certainly in terms of damaging society, I mean, the big damage is in the schools and these ideologies running riot in terms of preparing the next generation. And so that next generation, either they aren't educated properly and they don't learn the Popperian method at all, Because if you take something like critical race theory, it is unfalsifiable by
Yes,
definition.
it is.
The argument, yeah. So these meta theories. Now, of course, there is a role for meta theory in the university, but essentially these are they're trafficking in meta theories that cannot, by definition, be falsified, and then they just through force they imprint themselves everywhere in the university and the
And even
schools.
worse than that, disagreement with it is taken to be proof of the doctrine, right? So if you deny your racism, that's proof of your racism.
Yeah, the
Under critical
Kafka
race
trap,
theory,
I think
yeah,
is.
that's right. It's very much like that. So it's a very virulent form of a closed system of thinking in that
Yeah,
sense.
I mean, it relies on emotional manipulation and blackmail, all the sort of techniques that interrogators use or cults use, rather than, evidence and argument. And so, and that's been very effective. I mean, so this is one of the questions you might say is, well, how is it that those sort of emotional blackmail manipulation tactics worked so well in the modern university? And they did when these people occupied, did their sit-ins, accused professors of racism, and this goes back even to the late 60s, student protests in some cases. Um, the mainstream sort of liberal academic was pretty powerless
Mm.
in the face of these shouting and protests. These techniques, which are political techniques, all of the rational deliberation couldn't protect them, and it kind of shows you need a kind of counter politics that could shut down those kind of emotional
I mean
arguments.
that's an interesting reflection. I mean, you think of the Berkeley riots in particular being an example of that, and yet the rigor of the university survived that era, and it was still present when I was an undergraduate in the 1980s. I had a very rigorous training, and I would actually blame the commercialization of the university more for its demise in that regard, because not only its commercialization, but the decision taken throughout the West that a far higher proportion of the population needed a university degree, because that by definition pretty much has to drive down academic standards. If you're going from 5 or 8% of the population studying to 35%, well, obviously you're going to have a lower standard if all those extra people are going to get degrees, right? Assuming that we had any sort of meritocracy in the first place,
Right.
which I think we did. It wasn't a perfect one, but so
Yeah. Although I'm less convinced that that's really all that central in this story because the rot is most extreme in the elite institutions where the admission standards, I mean, even if you bracket affirmative action in America, but in most cases, these admission standards have gotten tougher, not
an
softer over
interesting point.
time.
Yeah.
And the rot has been most extreme in
Well,
those
actually, I think
elite.
we might be talking about two different things. I'm
Okay.
talking about the fall in academic standards, and I think
Okay.
you're talking about the woke takeover. But they are related in their effect, I believe, because where you have a loss of academic standards, then everything is just so much more susceptible to irrational thinking.
Yeah, yeah, no, I think that's a fair point, actually. I mean, you're right. This is sort of the two horses of the apocalypse, working side by side. And maybe there's some other horses like skyrocketing fees and
Yeah.
student debt, but yeah, I think there are all kinds of other problems in the university. Um, but I guess there is this question about why. I mean, this is where in my book, I mean, pay a lot more attention to the liberals than the radicals, and my argument is really that there was a very strong susceptibility. Why were Black Panther radicals like Angela Davis so eagerly hired at the most prestigious universities? There was this romance.
Right.
And so many academics were susceptible, these liberal academics were susceptible to this romantic revolutionary ideal. And I think it's because they were already steeped in the basic structure, majorities bad, minorities good, somehow virtuous, and therefore anything in their name must be good, and not having an answer to any claim made in the name of a minority group that has been in some ways a victim. And so I just think until we get the courage of our convictions, or until you get academics who have the courage to push back on, I guess, what Jonathan Haidt terms those two core moral intuitions of care, harm, and equality. Those are the only values that seem to matter. Those are the highest values
Yeah.
for most academics. And unless you have somebody to say, well, no, actually, we're going to put free speech and objective truth, the pursuit of truth,
At the
higher
highest
and above
point.
equality. Until you do that, and you have the courage to stand up to the emotional bullying, the emotional manipulation, and say, no, actually, this is the foundation of our civilization, and emotionally, it's more important.
Right.
Then I don't see how you can stand up to these people.
And so, perhaps as a final question, and it's a kind of unfair one because I'm going to ask you to crystal ball gaze a bit. What do you think the prospects are for the university in, say, the next 10 years and then further out? Do you think things will continue to collapse and maybe the university will start to lose its cultural prestige? Or do you think there may be a reformation of some sort coming?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, there's no question that the last 2 years in particular, 2 to 3 years, have seen a retreat from the high watermark um, of cancel culture. And you can see it in various types of data, including no platformings and professor targetings and all kinds of things. But and DEI has been cut back in the corporate world. And so there are certainly some indications that this kudzu has been cut back a little, the bush has been cut back a little bit. But I mean, the reason I'm pessimistic is because of the age structure. So younger academics are, twice as intolerant as older academics. And it's the same in terms of the population. Should J.K. Rowling be dropped by her publisher? It's amongst 18 to 25s, it's like 50-50, yes and no, versus a couple of percent in the rest of the population. So I just think we've got this new intolerant generation coming through. Will be the median academic, and therefore I just can't see how, because of that cohort change, I just can't see how the university moves away from social justice towards academic freedom. Now, legislate, where you might say there are some positives, I think the fact that the public is becoming more cynical about universities is a good thing.
Yeah.
And the Gallup data in the US shows, the degree to which the public has lost trust in the university. I mean, I think what that will mean is more pressure politically on the university, which again, I think is actually a good thing. And there are two ways this can happen. Britain, we had the Higher Education Freedom Bill. I was involved in that to some degree. That is really about saying universities can't fire and no platform and punish for speech. So I think these sorts of legislative moves will help protect academics from being fired, at least. But the point I make is that that's not going to protect them from not being hired or promoted or published or given a grant for speech, because that's controlled by their peers. And if peers have political prejudices, then you have to shut your mouth, and so you self-censor, even if your institution won't fire you. And so this problem of viewpoint diversity and peer-led self-censorship cannot be solved legislatively from the top, except in one way, and I think, and this is where, so I'm at University of Buckingham, which is sort of probably the renegade institution in Britain. Out of 181, it's the only one who I think clearly put free speech above equality. Now, most of the staff there are probably on the left, that's true, but at least the climate is one that's more conducive to dissent. And I think you could see in the US case where there are a lot more of these institutes and centers popping up that in many cases in the red states, have government funding and have their own power over hiring. And so at least you have some of these islands of viewpoint diversity within this progressive sea. That's at least something. It's not, but if they're producing more interesting work, or if the red state universities are freer and doing better in certain ways than the blue state universities, at least there's some pressures in the system to move away from the monoculture. Now, do I think that's going to save the university? I don't know.
Yeah.
But I think these are things that we can do to at least try and alleviate the pressure.
It's certainly worth trying, and let's hope the institution can be saved, because, as I said, I think it's the most powerful knowledge production institution the world has ever known, and it would be a tragedy to lose it. But look, thank you for your time today, Professor Kaufmann. It's been a fascinating conversation, and we could talk on, but I better let you get on with your day. So thank you so much.
Well, thanks, Michael. Yeah. Oh, by the way, I should just say, I mean, for any of your listeners who are interested, I have this new open online course on woke, which if you go to my Twitter.
We'll send me a link, and we'll post it below the clip. So
fantastic. Yeah. Well, but in any case, I've enjoyed the conversation, Michael, and keep up the good work down there in New Zealand.
Well, you too. We've got a tough battle ahead. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thanks a lot.